welcome to the Demography Today lecture series, and welcome to our first training workshop on historical occupational classifications and stratification schemes. The Demography Today lecture series are sponsored by the BBVA Foundation, and they are organized in coordination with the Spanish National Research Council and the LOMPOC project, the European LOMPOC project. And we are lucky today to have here Richard Zijdeman. He is the Chief Data Officer at the International Institute of Social History. He is a project leader for the structured data component of the Common Lab Research Infrastructure of the Art and Humanities, CLARIA, at the same institute. He is one of the experts that we have in Europe on coding, classification, occupational classification, and the organization of occupational classifications, working with historical data. And today he will be talking about different occupational classifications that we have, like HISCO, HISCLASS, and HISCAM. So we will have 2 hours lecture at the beginning, and then we will have a break, and afterwards we will have another 2 hours just to work with some of the data and just to learn how to use this information. So welcome to the SIC, and the floor is yours. We will be listening to you, and we will be making questions probably.
Yes, maybe in between small groups. So.
Because this is a more kind of informal than the lecture series. It's a training workshop, so you have questions, you can just ask Richard, and then later with the practice, we will be working with R. So those who are following through Periscope, I recommend that they download R, and we will mention later the packages that they will need to be using. So just to later on to have the possibility to follow the following part of the presentation.
Yeah.
So the floor is yours.
Thank you. So a bit of an outline before we get started. So first of all, I understand that a lot of you are demographers, and you might wonder why would we need occupations. So I'll try and advocate the use of occupations first. Then we go into a number of common stratification, occupational classification schemes. And in the end, if there's still time, I would like to show you some work that I'm doing now. So using linked open data to make occupational coding easier. Personally, having a sociological background, occupations are really important as indicator of social position. So this is a quote by Rose, stating that it is market position, and especially position in the occupational division of labor, which is fundamental to the generation of structured inequalities. The life chances of individuals and families are largely determined by their position in the market, and occupation is taken to be its central indicator. So this is basically saying that whether you have an occupation or not, and the kind of occupation that you have, if you have one, kind of determines the resources that you're able to get to. And those resources can be wage, they can be social capital, so who do you know? It might be prestige, so how do people regard you in their job? And these are all resources that are very difficult to measure, but once we grasp occupation, once we know someone's occupation, we might get a feel for all of these different aspects of an occupation. This is another quote by Harry Gensenboom, at least in the Netherlands famous, but I think also internationally well recognized, stating that occupations can be used as an outcome, but also as a say explanatory variable. So we can use occupation to look at life expectancy, but we can also use human capital to see in what kind of occupations people end up with. And then again, we're not really interested whether it's baker or farmer, but more the amount of resources that people get that. Now, so this is for sociologists reason enough to work with occupations, but for historians or people working with historical materials like myself and I believe like you, there are a number of other great features about occupations. As you know, historical data is really scarce to get by. And if you find something, it's seldom that you find it in multiple places. Now the good thing about occupations is they come in large quantities. So if you look at birth records, you often get the name of the father. If you get marriage records, you might get the name of the groom, the father, and the father-in-law, sometimes even for brides and mothers. And so there are all kinds of sources that provide you these occupations. So these were two examples of the same kind, but also if you look at company ledgers, income, overviews, occupations is very often mentioned. This is something which is basically done for a very long time. So it's not just that we're now interested in occupations. Actually, the idea about occupations goes back into the classic age where people were categorized into, say, gold, silver, bronze, and metal according to what type of occupation they had. And that, I mean, that's really rough, but basically the idea to register occupations and to get information from that is very old. So the good thing is, even if you want to look at long periods in time, maybe 2 or 3 centuries, you're able to use occupations. Try another indicator for which you know that, maybe sex and age, but after that it kind of stops. And so this argument also goes for say the universality of it. So we find it in the Netherlands, we find it in Spain, we basically find it everywhere. And the last point on the slide is a lot of characteristics that we often have on, say, a country level or a region level, and this we often find even on the individual level. And the great thing about it is that we can then compare individuals and see how they change over time. Because sometimes we also have multiple observations on the individual level. And if you have that, you can therefore measure cause and effect. So you can see what someone's occupation in the beginning of his career, what is his occupation in the end of his career, and was there any growth. And if you know something about his environment, like his father's occupational status, and you compare that across people, you can actually make claims about whether it's important to come from a high background in order to get a high career or not. So occupations are, so they're all around, they have been for a very long time, and they are on a very precise level. Now obviously occupations are also the worst thing to work with. They come in all kinds of spelling errors, languages. Sometimes they mean the same, but they are called differently. Sometimes they're called differently, but actually the meaning of the job didn't change. And if you think of all these spelling variations, it makes it very hard to compare occupations with each other. In order to solve that problem, people have tried to kind of group occupations. So not really looking at the occupational title per se, like whether it says baker or baker at the baker shop, but saying, oh, everyone that's doing kind of bakery or maybe people working in butcher shop or shoe selling shop, they're all kind of doing the same thing, namely working with a product and trying to sell it. So we put them into a certain group. And those groups were then often linked to, say, classes, to kind of socio-economic prestige. And by doing so, it made it possible for people to kind of condense that information and present it in table format. So if you do that for multiple observations over time, you could actually see, oh look, people actually went from lower class to higher class. So it's a very good idea to kind of aggregate that information a little bit. but everyone was doing it in their own way. And that meant that, say, some occupations ended up in a different class in one study than in another study. And then this made it very hard to compare studies across each other. And actually, Kelbe actually said, so differences in mobility studies could result from different classification methods. So the differences we find in patterns of social stratification, so whether society becomes more open or actually closes, might actually not be a true result or something that actually happened, but it might be the result of the way we try and categorize these occupations, and since everyone does it in a different way. So in order to tackle that, there's been a major international initiative by the International Labour Office, and they created HISCO. And HISCO stands for International Standard Classification of Occupations. What it does, it looks at an occupational title and then sees what kind of activities are related to that occupational title, and then gives that a certain code. And then it looks at, say, another occupation and sees whether these occupational activities are the same, and if they are, it gets the same code. And the good thing about it is that if you look at an occupation that way, you can look across different time periods, but also across different languages. So occupations in different languages might be coded into the same code. And that makes it possible to do comparative research on the occupational level. So HISCO 1968 was the first one really internationally adopted, and so people used that to do comparative research in the 70s. But as you know, some jobs, like the person now making the video or people doing programming, those are pretty new jobs, and over time jobs also tend to disappear. So once in a while we need to have new classifications of these occupations. So hence in 1988 another one was made, and the latest one was from 2008. So they differ in the way that they account for new occupations and take away all occupations. Now, the 1968 obviously contains some, say, very old occupations, because some jobs are very old, but they obviously did not contain the really detail that you would need to study 19th century data. So a group of researchers decided to create a similar thing like HISCO 1968, but for historical time periods, focusing on the 19th and early 20th century. So the book, you might have seen the book. So it's a great book, gold letters, HISCO, and it's written by Ineke Maas, Marco van Leeuwen, and Andy Miles. But I always like to emphasize that, so they did an awful lot of work with the three of them, but I always like to emphasize that the book is actually the result of a really big collaboration between 8 different partners, so 8 different institutes, all expert in occupation, so knowing what a certain occupation meant at a certain point in time. So, for example, in France, if you have a baker, it can be very different what kind of baker it is. So it might be more like a pâtissier who's making the really nice cakes, or it might be a boulanger making the bread. In the Netherlands, we're not that rich in our vocabulary, and so it's very difficult to translate between the two. So you need historical experts to actually see what it means to be in that occupation, what kind of activities go along with it, and then find a code for it and compare it to other occupations. So these 8 institutes and people working in those institutes, they created HISCO. So in order to do that, they needed occupations. So they took occupations from 8 Western European countries from the 19th and early 20th century, and in total used about 2.4 million records. Yeah, so that's a lot of data. Mind you, it's a lot of Western data. Yeah, that's something we'll get to. But it is a fact. So HISCO is already more than a decade old, so in the West, that data was available. So it makes sense for them to focus on the available data. So HISCO, the code that actually came about is slightly different from the original HISCO codes. So it's not just the 5-digit code. Who knows HISCO a little bit? Yeah, so okay, so 2 out of closely 10 people, for the people not in the room. You probably are aware of the 5-digit code indicating a certain group of occupations. But it actually is complemented by subsidiary classifications. So something in addition to the code telling you about the occupation. And the reason for this is that sometimes the occupational description is much broader than just the occupation. So it tells you a little bit about a relation or a relationship, or it tells you a little bit about the degree of advancedness, degree of seniority in that occupation. And the subsidiary classifications are used for that. I already see some puzzled faces. So occupational category, what are you talking about? So think of a job like I don't know, research analyst. This is a specific kind of job that comes with a specific set of duties. But there might be jobs that are pretty much the same. So analyst in research, it's a different title, but or maybe student assistant might also do some research and analyze certain things. So if you look at the occupational activities, so the things that one does for his job, and if these are the same, you kind of group them, so you make it into a category. And that's what we mean by occupational category. So for jobs, often I use jobs to indicate just the one occupation, and occupational category or occupations as a group. Now, this is an example from HISCO. So, filing clerk. It has this specific format to write down. It starts with a 3, then 9530, and then it has a description stating classifies and systematically files papers, documents, and other records. So if you have any occupation that you think belongs to that category, you give that 39530 code to that occupation. Another example is wood turner. My grandfather used to be a wood turner, and so he would be at 8, 12, 30, shaping wood, rotating in a lathe using hand tools. So you have this wood spinning around, and then you carve it, and then you create a candle or something. So you already saw this kind of, do you see my mouse as well? Yeah. So this kind of formatted number, and that is because the number consists of different sections. So the first number is what we call the major group. And major group is just a grouping of occupations into the broadest way possible. So occupation group 6 is everyone working in agriculture. Yeah, so basically anyone in the primary sector is in major group 6. Then within that major group you would like to make distinctions between what people are doing. So you go a little bit down into minor groups. So 6.1 would be the minor groups for farmers, but you could also have a minor group for people helping out at the farm. So that could be another minor group. Going further down, you go into the unit groups. So here 6.1.1 is general farmer, but you could also think of specific types of farming, like people working with cattle or people working with grain. So there are different unit groups, and then finally within the general farmers we can make very detailed distinctions, like here the code for small subsistence farmer is 61115. So this 5-digit code is not only indicating specific categories or categories of job activities, it also allows you to kind of group occupations into different layers. So if you were interested in everyone working in agriculture, you would just need to look at the HISCO code 6. Another example, so HISCO code 83930 is actually in a major group 789. So that's a bit funny. There's no major group 7. They're all condensed in major group 789, which is basically anyone working in production. Then we go another level down, 8.3, minor groups, blacksmiths, toolmakers, and machine tool operators. The specific unit group is blacksmiths, and a locksmith is then, say, the real particular type of occupation. Usually we are just interested in the 5-digit occupations, but sometimes so if you're interested in specific research on industrial sectors, you might want to work with either the minor or unit groups, because it then gives you a better overview of all the occupations in that category. Now, like I said, there's not just this HISCO code, there's also additional information, and this is captured in 3 variables, status, relation, and product. And so status is actually well, what you would suspect status is. So it says something about say the degree to which you I'm not sure how to say this. Well, for example, if you so you can do a job, but you could be like the head in that job, or you could be the person actually doing the work. You would have still the same job title, but one is the head and the other is like the assistant. So status helps you to indicate whether someone, whether there was a certain hierarchy in there. Another one is, say, indication of whether you're a student or someone still learning on the job. And then finally there's like pure status, so that's like nobility related things. Now you could imagine that if you are in a job but you're a principal, this might have a different effect when you ask someone to marry, or when you get the when you ask your father-in-law, could I marry your daughter? And then say, oh, you're a principal, yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Oh, you're a student, no. So this information is lost when you just use the HISCO codes. So coding this information from the occupational title is very important, but it's often forgotten, because it's a lot of work. Coding occupations is already a lot of work, and then to do these extra variables is also a lot of work, and then people tend not to do it, but it's a shame because it messes up your results in the end. Relation is just about the relationship to the job. So think about farmer's wife. There are books written about whether farmer's wife is an occupation or not. By coding it as a wife, you at least know, okay, so this is a farmer, so the occupational title is farmer. but we also know it didn't say farmer, it said farmer's wife. So whatever the outcome of the discussion on whether that's a job or not, you use that variable in order to say, okay, I tend to give it less prestige because it wasn't the male farmer but the female farmer, or I give it additional credit because farmer's wife was one of the hardest jobs around. So by preserving that information, you again help to do research on your model. Finally, there's product. So if you sell things, it makes a lot of difference what you sell. If you sell potatoes, it's different from selling diamonds. Yeah. So again, this information. So you're basically a salesperson in HISCO, but by preserving the product category, you preserve a little bit more information. Are there any questions so far? Because it is turning into a lecture now. Okay. Now, obviously, we don't always have occupations. Maybe I boasted a bit too much in the introduction. Sometimes we get no descriptions or very poor descriptions. For example, instead of writing down the occupation, it says move to Valencia. And then, so there's no occupation in there. People try to preserve it, so they wrote it down in your Excel file anyway, but you can't do anything with it. So for that we use code -1. Now, if it specifically says no occupation, which is actually also not an occupation, but it is good information, so we give it another code -2. And then sometimes you have like these descriptions that you think, this could be an occupation, but no one knows what it is. So you have all these occupational dictionaries, but you couldn't find it, and so you give it this 999 code. So these are just, say, missing codes mentioned in the book. So for having no information at all, stating that there's no occupation or some vague reference. So this was just a theory. So now I would like to go into okay, how do we go about? So the best thing is to do this in a step-by-step way, and so the steps are basically the bullet points on the slide. So if you think of your Excel file or CSV file and you have the description, the first thing you need to wonder is like, okay, is there something on occupational information in there? If there's not, so you code it -1 or -2 or even the 999, and if it's yes, you code it into HISCO. So actually already broke my own scheme. So if there's occupation, but you can, you try to figure out what it was, but you can't, so you code it in 999. And if it contains 2 occupations, you first you code the first and most important one. It's really great if you also code multiple occupations, and actually there's now an increasing amount of research on the second occupations and what it means for society. So at our institute there's actually really large group of people working on labor relations, and this basically means so whether people have what relationship people have to their employer or employee, but also whether they have multiple jobs to make ends meet, because this says a lot about occupations too. But the general procedure is to code at least the first occupation, and if you're able to do the second one as well, that's great. Now, obviously, it could happen that you find an occupation that you could code into 2 categories, like a pilot. So pilot. So doing my internship in Stirling, we found pilots, lots of them, in 19th century Canadian data, and that seemed a bit weird because planes were invented at the end of the 19th century only, and then had to have lots of pilots. But so it turned out that these are boatsmen steering the boats. I didn't notice. So it's one title, but two possible codes. So either for aviator or for this boatsman, and so you need to kind of use historical context to code it. If you start coding, it's very tempting to ask the colleague that already did some coding to ask for his file. And then use all of that coding and then look at, oh, he has a butcher, well, this says butcher yada yada, must be the same. So you take that code and, works at the butcher shop, you give it also the same code. I've done it, it's not the best thing. So the best thing to code your occupations is actually to go digit by digit. So first decide, is my occupation something more of a 6-1, so in the farming, or is it more of a 5-4, so in service work? And if you do it like that, you take away the biggest mistake you could make, namely put someone in a wrong group, because once you've solved that first two digits, afterwards it's just looking at whatever is plausible, but in the beginning it's very tough to make that call on the 5 digit at one. So it's best to code first digits at first, and then code all of the others. And then that's also a very good point to ask that file from your colleague and see what he or she decided on that. And so this is actually a technique that Harry Ganzenboom has described in the do's and don'ts of occupational coding. So if you have the slides, I circulated them already. This is the PDF file, so whenever you see something like this and you click on it, it links to the PDF file. So Harry Ganzenboom has been coding, I don't know, 10 millions of occupations in his life, and really amazing. So any experience he got from that, he wrote down in this PDF file. So it's very valuable to look at it if you also start coding. Now you might have heard of alternative schemes like HISCO or PST. Did you? No, you just know HISCO. Great. Then so I'll talk a little bit later on alternative schemes then, but won't confuse you for now. Now then there's always the question, yes, but in addition to this occupational title, I know so and so about my people. So for example, you have data with farmers in them and you come from Sweden. Well, in Sweden they know everything. So then you also know what kind of farm it was, how many acres and stuff like that. So you want to preserve that information. So you want to use that information to code small subsistence farmer in an even better category. The same goes for like race, which is very important if you look at US data. So race determines a lot about which occupations are open to you and which are not. But the thing here to remember is that while you might have that very great information, many of the other people don't. So in the beginning I stressed that occupations is one of the few things that are around for a very long time and across a very wide space. Other information like the size of your land or the race of your individuals that you're looking at is not. So the best thing to do is to just code the occupations based on whatever information you have in that occupational field, because that makes it comparable to the efforts of others. Then later on in your model, you can use that great information to determine, say, social mobility. I'm sorry, you can determine what the effect of that great information is on social mobility. So you can add race in your model, or you can add size of the land in your model, But once you put it into the HISCO, it makes it very difficult to make results comparable for others. Where can you get help? Well, today there's me, so please feel free to ask anything. There's the HISCO book. I'm not sure whether, so there's how many million? 1 million titles in the library. It's amazing. So the HISCO book must be there as well. And so there's also a resource site, collab.isg.nl/HISCO. And this is, so collab stands for collaboratory, so you can already download materials without making an account. But if you make an account, there's an opportunity to ask questions or to share your own materials. So that's what I wanted to say about HISCO, and then before I move on, I would like to look around and see whether any questions already is, no, okay, I keep barging on that. The most crucial thing about today is to get the difference between what I was talking about just now, HISCO, and what I will be talking about in the next half hour or so. And that's that's the stratification of those occupations. So the HISCO it basically says standard classification of occupations. All it does is classify occupations according to activity. It doesn't say anything about whether an occupation is high or low in terms of prestige, or so whether it has a high class or a low class. But that's often what we're interested in. And because activities are pretty much determinant for the class, people sometimes make the mistake that, okay, if I code it into HISCO, I'm done. And I can see whether if people get a high HISCO code, they get a better job. And this is actually true because by accident or by coincidence, people that are say in administration, they get a code in the 2s, like so anyone that's a manager or say a counselor, they get like 2-1. So they're pretty up high. And everyone working with their hands, they're up in 7, 8, 9. So they're low. So please, that's just by coincidence. If they turn it around or shuffled in any way. So HISCO is just about making the titles comparable. If you want to know whether an occupation is high or low, you would need something to classify those occupations according to a hierarchy. So there are various ways to do that. One is prestige scores. So Tryman C-ups, I'm not sure whether any of these things mean anything to you. So it's basically an index of what people think of an occupation as a high or low occupation. So the way you do it, you write down maybe a few hundred occupations, put them on cards, maybe 20 occupations per card, and then you give them out, and then you say, okay, rank from 1 to 20. And then you do it across multiple countries, or say you can look at gender, how women value something. So it's kind of an index of what people think is a high occupation or not. And there's socioeconomic indexes. So this basically says how much education do you need to get into a certain occupation, and how much income does that get you. So the more education you need to get into an occupation, and the more income you get, the higher the ICI. So these are more continuous ways of thinking about occupation. So there's like a continuous scale of low to high, and there might be an infinite number of layers in there. Social class is of course a very different concept. So it's more about, say, the extent to which you have access to resources, and that determines different groups in society. Basically the haves and the have-nots, and this can be in terms of human capital, so whether you're skilled or not, but it can also actual capital, so whether you have money or buildings or whatever. And these are, for example, the Erickson, Goldthorpe and Portocarrero class scheme, and for historical time periods there's SOCPO and HISCLASS. Finally, there's one that's actually resembling more the first two. It's again a continuous scale, but it's based on actual behavior. So people look at who's friends with whom, and then they're not really interested in the people themselves, but in the occupation. So which occupations go out with other occupations, or which occupations have a coffee with other occupations. And so that's a form of social interaction from which you can also derive a layer of high and low occupations. The first two I won't go into. So today's focus is on social class, and so this where HISCLASS is the one I'll be talking about a little bit, and the other one is HISCAM. So social classes, they are aggregations of occupations. Are there any historians in the room? No. Okay. So basically, historians always dread, and with good right, always dread aggregating data, because if you aggregate data, you lose informational detail. So, so a farm worker might be different from someone who works at a farm. There could be some historical reason why there's this difference, and if you're really interested in a specific instance on agriculture, this might be a crucial aspect to your research. However, if it's very hard to contain all that detail and do comparative research. So I think most of you sitting here doing comparative studies, you will need to kind of let go of that detail and aggregate data. So that's what happens when you take information from the occupations and put it into social classes. So you group occupations, and each group is defined, for example, by van Leeuwen and Maas, as a set of persons with the same life chances. So if you're born and you're so yesterday the talk was also on forecasting. So if you're forecasted to be in a certain situation, and everyone around you is too, you are all from the same class. So in order to kind of define these groupings, HISCLASS takes a number of dimensions. So the first dimension is whether you work or not. So these dimensions determine, the first dimension is whether you work with your hands or not. So these dimensions all determine your life chances. The other one is scale, so between brackets there's the number of dimensions that they distinguish between. This could be scale in the sense that you did an internship. It could also be more formal education later on in the 20th century. Whether you provide supervision or not, and hence, so you can see here the importance of the status variable. If you didn't code that one, it's very tough to code into HISCLASS. And then there's economic sector. But basically, economic sector is just whether you work in agriculture or not. Now, if you think of these four dimensions, you could see that you get kind of a ranking. So you're either in manual, and you're skilled, and you provide supervision. So you might be, so non-manual is better, is higher up because it means you're working with your head, so you probably had some training already. But so you could imagine that once you combine all these categories, you get kind of a table where each of these dimensions is scored, and then it results in a number of classes. I'm going. Hang on. Oh yeah. So okay. So this results in a number of classes. So these are just 4 dimensions, but if you take all of these possibilities, you end up with a HISCLASS scheme, which is about 12 different classes. In order to actually create the scheme, they did not, Van Leeuwen and Maas, they did not think what was best themselves. They tried to get information from the Dictionary of Occupational Titles in the US to see how each occupation actually ranked according to these dimensions. So if it said butcher, they would look up butcher in the DOT, and then it would say this person cleans meat, had so much education, has these skills in running a business, and then based on all those decisions, they said, okay, then you go into this and this HISCLASS. So basically, with the HISCO, that made it already much easier to categorize all this information. And then they asked historical experts for their opinion on, so do you think that this occupation is manual or non-manual, skilled or unskilled? And then they compared what they had from the Dictionary of Occupational Titles with what the experts had said, so the historical experts. Because the problem with the DOT is it's from 1965, and also it's from US. So that's in itself not a problem, but for comparison with 19th century Western European data, it might be, the occupational structure might be different. So the historical experts looked at it and most of the time agreed, but sometimes said, well, we don't think this is quite right. In that case, if there was a big incongruence, they went with the experts, and so they placed an occupation in a certain HISCLASS. Now, if you want to code your data into HISCLASS, so first you need to have your occupations translated into HISCO, and then with that you can go from HISCO to HISCLASS using an SPSS script, which is on the website that I showed earlier, so the Collab website. And there's one thing to notice about it. If you have information on whether the people are from a more rural area, you can code those specifically if the labor is not well defined. So if there's just laborers, it's always tough to decide whether they're laborers in agriculture or whether they're factory laborers. So using information on the context of your data, you are able to code those either as factory laborers or as agricultural laborers. I think HISCLASS is a major achievement in comparative research across historical sociology, economic history, basically everyone working with historical data. And so this is not just me saying this. The other day, a paper by Humphreys and Weisdorf. So it is really economic history. They also use the HISCO and HISCLASS to define skill levels in occupations. So I really think it's a great thing. But there's also some things that I would like to point at. So one is the role of experts. So basically, what they did is they created this nice dimensions and then said, well, if the experts think it's wrong, we're going to change it. But basically, if you take it very black and white, so basically HISCLASS is like an expert opinion, because what the experts agree with wasn't changed, so it's made from the DOT, and what the the experts thought is now implemented in HISCLASS. What I always find very difficult to understand from people that study history is that they have very little information to go on compared to all of the data we have now. So their pioneer views are based on much smaller data sets than we have nowadays. And I think, so that's something to keep in mind. So sure, they're experts, but we now also have much more data to go about. So always carefully check your data against such issues. If you would be reluctant to use, say, this expert opinion, you could use SOCPO, a social power scheme by Miles and van der Putte, which is really just a theoretical scheme. And you could also use both and see how your analysis differed for different models. The other thing is aggregation of classes. So if you code into HISCLASS, sometimes there's just too few data in a certain class. So you could imagine if you code into 12 classes, there's just for a number of occupations like mayors and alike, just too few people in a certain category. And then you need to collapse classes. And this might be a bad thing if you do social mobility research. So the fewer classes you have, the less mobility there's possible. So if you have 12 classes and you start at the bottom, you can go up 11. If you condense it into 5, you can only go up 4. As long as people use the same collapses, it's pretty much okay, because you can compare them across different papers. But unfortunately, people use various versions, so 4, 5, 7. I think 5 and 7 are the most used. So if you need to collapse, take a look at the papers you want to compare to, and use that as well. And don't collapse in a very different way. So don't think, okay, I'm going to take 1 and 8 because in my paper that makes sense. And if it would make sense in your paper, please do in the appendix an analysis with like the 5 or 7 class scheme, so others can compare their results against yours. And what I also think is a shame. So the SPSS thing is the only thing I know that allows you to go from HISCO to HISCLASS. So there's no mapping table. But there's it's just someone with our skills that rewrites this and then. Or as data skills, and then you're done. This was about HISCLASS. Are there any questions on this? Yeah.
The experts, how were they selected? Is this like, did they come from different backgrounds?
Yes. So I'm not sure how they were selected, but so these are really the best people in the field, and so there's actually also a HISCLASS book that elaborates more on how this worked, and it's so again, so there were probably not too much instances in which this changed, which basically corroborates that the experts had it right. It underlines that the experts said it right. It's just, if you look at how many millions of occupations we now have access to, it's just something to keep in mind. It's a more subjective thing, but from the best people in the field. So.
Right, I was also thinking of the cultural background, or when people, I don't know, the experts from Sweden that know about occupations in Sweden.
Yes, indeed. So yeah. It's exactly like that. So maybe I'm making more fuss out of it than I should, but okay. Other questions? No. That was it on the classes. So now we move on to HISCAM, And but HISCAM is actually like HISCO. It's a derivative of a modern skill. And so the modern skill is the Cambridge Social Interaction and Stratification skill. So the big difference with this skill compared to well, classes is that it only needs one assumption. So we don't need to have assumptions on whether it makes a difference that you're manual or non-manual, or whether you have property or not. The one and only assumption is that interaction determines the distance between occupations. So if you interact a lot with someone, this assumption says that that this person's occupation is very close to yours in terms of the occupational stratification. And this, this might make sense if you see who's going out with each other or who's marrying each other. You tend to see that occupations that are close also in terms of classes marry more often. The good thing about this one or this single assumption characteristics is that we can apply it for different time periods and different regions. So we don't need specific information on property levels or education levels, which is very difficult, for example, for the 19th and early 20th century. How are you going to compare an apprenticeship to 5 years in high school? So that's a difficulty when doing class analysis. And then finally, because you can look at social interaction at the individual level, you can take all kinds of characteristics and make subsidiary classifications for those. So you could look at occupational groupings for elderly. So yesterday part of the lecture was also on how old do people really get? So if they're 65, are you really old then? And so it might actually be that say these still young, older people have very different occupational networks than the younger people. So here the example is gender. Female occupations might group very different. I'm sorry, women in occupations might group very differently than men in occupations. So the idea is that the more interaction there is between different occupations, the closer the distance, and so there's some technical stuff to analyze this, but basically it's just looking at correlation or association. And there's one thing that's going wrong here, and so who could come up with an example where there's lots of occupational interaction, but it doesn't say anything about the actual occupational structure, so whether occupations are close or not. It happens in planes, in hospitals, and it's a bit naughty. So if you think of a plane, so you have two people working in planes, pilots and stewardesses. They often get married, but it's not to say that, say, the pilot's occupation is very close to the steward's occupation. Same is with doctors and nurses, and there are a number of other examples where we see lots of occupational interactions, but it's not really reflective of the occupational structure that we're thinking of. Now these things are called pseudo-diagonals, and the reason is, so if you make this association table, you would have, say, farmer, butcher on the one hand, and so these would this could be, say, the individuals in your data set. And then on the y-axis, you again have farmers, butchers, but these are then the friends of those individuals in the data set. And so it means that on the diagonal, you get farmers with farmers, butchers with butchers. So this doesn't tell you anything about distance between occupations. So you always take out the diagonals. Now these occupations like pilots and stewardesses or doctors and nurses, these are called pseudo-diagonals because they also don't tell us anything about the actual distance between the occupations, and so they're also taken out when doing the analysis. So in order to create a historical version of this, so this is the Cambridge scale is like a modern version, and it's based on friendship patterns, I believe also family patterns. So there are all kinds of ways to look at these interactions. For the historical version, we just look at family relationships with historical data. Again, it's seven Western countries, so most of the data that were used for HISCO since most of the data from HISCO is also same time period. But since HISCO there was already a bit more data, and so we created with HISCAM 12 different scales. So if you throw in all occupations, you can get kind of a universal scale, like any interaction of an occupation with other occupation. But you could also say, well, you know, female occupations are very different, or women in occupations, and for historical times that basically always means female occupations, are very different from male occupations. And so the prestige that goes with that should be on a different scale than when you compare male occupations. So if that's important for your research, or if you're just looking at women in your research, you might consider just looking at all interactions of occupations in which women were incumbent. So we have different scales for men and women. The same thing you could argue for early and late periods. When industrialization came about, it obviously had a great impact on the occupational structure. So we, for each country, we kind of try to figure out what the turning point was from say non-industrial to industrial, and then so for each country there's a different time point, and before this turning point we call it early, and after the turning point we call it late. And you can indeed see that some occupations in the early phase are ranked in a different position than in the late phase, so after industrialization. If you're interested in changes over time in the status of occupations, this might be a very good scale for you, so to look at the early versus late scale. And then obviously there might be differences between different countries, for each of the countries we've made a unique scale, so just using data from that country. There's also a big warning. In order to do these analyses you need lots of data, really lots of data. Even for the unique scale, 4.5 million records were not enough to do this analysis. So we have group data as well. And so if there were not more than 20 observations in a certain HISCO category, we group them. And so for the that's what was for the universal scale already. So if you just look at men, or if you just look at a country, this is bound to get worse. So if in doubt, just use the universal scale. I think it's the most sturdy one, and only if you have really specific country-specific questions or gender-specific questions, look into the other scales. HISCO ranges from, HISCAM ranges from 0 to 99, where 99 is an extreme occupation, judges, professors, they're all there. And so it's, not sure whether it means something, but if you have these associations, it could be that one occupation is really far away, it's the outlier, and other occupations as well. So in order to make it measurable, we put it on the 0-99 scale, and in order to do that, so we set the mean to 50 with standard deviation of 10. And that means that So that means that all the occupations are able to be fit within this range of 0 to 99. It also means, so if you're a little bit into statistics, it also shows you how big the deviances are within this scale. So it's, yeah, being a 99 is very different from being, say, a 30. It's really extreme. So I already mentioned there's no friendship relationships because we use this historical data, so everything is marriage relationships. I think so. I just lied about 20 occupations. I think it was 20 occupations, but so anyway, the thing to remember is that even with 4.5 million records, we had to do stuff in order to make this work. So I think actually most of these I covered, except for the circularity point. So there's always kind of like a hunch that say, okay, well, I want to do social mobility analysis in Sweden, and then I use HISCAM. But actually, HISCAM was using Swedish data. So is that not a circular argument? And in fact, it's not, because HISCAM it's not just the Swedish occupational structure. It takes all of this different occupational structure, and even if you would just use the Swedish occupational scale, then still there's this aggregation of all these occupations. So you're looking at a very different interpretation of the data than when you look at one-on-one relationships. So who's marrying who, or who's getting the better job compared to his father. So it's understandable that you think about this point, but it's really not the same thing. Yeah, is that clear, or is it? Okay.
We have a question from
Yeah.
the audience.
Oh, sure. Oh, hi, audience.
Right. Yeah. And the question is it problematic for HISCAM if non-observed people, singles or orphans, are very different compared to observed people in the occupational, like people in occupation, in terms of occupational prestige?
Yes. That's thank you for the question. So that's a very good question because indeed these people, orphaned or non-married, are not represented in this data. So the easy response is, well, luckily there's not too much of those around. So compared to all other people, for a lot of people we actually know their parents. And people used to get married in the 19th century, so today that would be a bit different. So that's the easy answer. But even if even if that would not hold, you might wonder how would singles and orphans would be different in their occupations compared to non-orphans or non-singles. So there would be something very peculiar about the interpretation of how we look at singles or orphans in terms of status. Now, again, this might, especially for orphans, might be true because you might be considered a bastard, whether this is true or not. But if you're abandoned, that's not a good thing. If you think this is important, please add it as a variable to your model. So you can just use the HISCAM scale and then add this to your model, single or orphaned, and see whether this determines which partner you find or what job you get in a different way. It feels very unequal for the audience not to respond immediately. But okay. I hope. Please let me know if it's a good.
Right.
answer.
Yeah. That's. I hope also that you know that we are not on our phones too. Like.
Oh no. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. So questions. Yeah, that was the question. I would now like to then go to something I'm working on currently, and is so are we taking breaks, or are we just flat out for?
We can have. I mean, we can organize as you want.
Yeah.
We can have a break now or at 12.
Yeah.
And then we will follow up with the practical.
Okay, great.
part.
So maybe I continue a little bit, and then we have a break. So yeah. Okay. Oh. Hang on. Yeah. Basically, this was everything there was to know. And then there's the current situation. And so the current situation is what I would like to talk to next. So we talked about this problem, lack of comparability of occupational titles, and this is actually a very fun class scheme by Charles Bruce in the 19th century. So so here there's the upper, middle, and upper classes. Well, it sounds like a proper class description, but down here there's the lowest class, the vicious and semi-criminal. Just a indication of class schemes have been around for quite a while, and yes, we would change those all the time because this would not make it through any political or correct research. Currently there's HISCO and there's HISCAM. So we classify into the concept, and then we link this concept, so HISCO, to a measure of stratification. What concept are we using? Because I'm lucky with this audience only knowing about HISCO, but actually there are others around. So there's HISCO and there's PST, and there might be even others. And so HISCO was created when the NAP, the North Atlantic Population Project, was in effect. So the people from the North Atlantic Population Project, they were looking at the US census and censuses, and so they had to code an awful amount of data. And they looked at HISCO and they said, this is terribly detailed and we need to code 2 centuries of data. This is not going to work. So we make a revised version of HISCO. So the original HISCO has 1,600 categories, and HISCO has about 350. Yeah, so there's much less detail in HISCO. But there was also another problem, and that's the census data. They were derived also with economic insights, so they were meant to derive economic insights. So often the occupational description is in the census is not a real occupational description, it's more of a sectorial description. So it gives you much more information about the occupational sector, or the industry, rather than the occupation itself. And coding into HISCO would mean that you would lose that information. Now there are a number of other arguments why HISCO came about and why people used it. There's a paper on it in Historical Methods. But the fact is that we now have data in the North Atlantic Population Project, which is coded in a different way than Western European data. And it's not really easy to go between the two, as I will show you later on. The other thing is called PST. PST stands for primary, secondary, and tertiary. And it's from the Cambridge Geography group. And they felt that for their research they needed something that goes into detail, as much detail as HISCO, but also preserves the information on sector. So it's kind of an HISCO plus. So HISCO is better in sectorial information, and they wanted to have it in a very granular way, so they designed PST. So if you now code your occupations, the question is, do I code them in HISCO, HISCO, or PST? And despite the goodness that comes about from having various tools around, so more for sectors or more for occupations, the bad thing is coding occupations is a lot of work, and if we code into different schemes, we cannot use the information from each other. Now, another problem is if you are interested in social mobility research in the US, you have your codes in HISCO, but there's no comparative measure that allows you to stratify these people. So yes, there are US 1950 measures of stratification and prestige, but these are then not comparable to historical Western European things like HISCLASS or even COMSIS. Yeah, it's a bit difficult. And then a third problem is the adaptability. So HISCO was created, and I know here in Spain there have been two major undertakings to code Spanish occupations and Catalan occupations into HISCO, and this also meant that there were occupational titles for which there was no place in HISCO. So new titles have been created by the people coding the Spanish and Catalan data, but how do we know about that? So unless you are very familiar with these new codes in Spain, you would be able to adopt them, say, to Dutch codes or Swedish codes. So the adaptability of new codes, that's something which is also problematic today. Well, you might say, well, okay, it's it's not nice. It's all different names and stuff like that. But okay, maybe in Spain you have a category that the Dutch don't have. But is that a real problem? So, in order to show the size of the problem, I take a subset of the same occupational titles that are both in NAP and HISCO. So it's really the same occupational strings, and some are coded in HISCO, and some are coded in HISCO. And so I'm going to link these next to HISCAM. And for HISCO that's easy, because there's a direct link between HISCO and HISCAM. For HISCO it's more difficult. So we first need to go from HISCO to HISCO, so from 300 categories back to one of the 1600 categories, and then it's easy because then we can go from HISCO to HISCO. Now, if you do a scatter plot, if you then graph these occupational entries, so on the x-axis, so I hope you can see the mouse. Yeah. So actually this looks like a big black bar, but it's not. It's just 1,000 very small stripes. So one stripe for each occupation. So if you follow such a stripe or occupation more up high, what you hope to find is something like this. So the directly derived codes, here in blue, so this is HISCO to HISCAM directly, are at the same position, right? So get the same HISCAM score as the indirectly derived, so HISCO to HISCO to HISCAM. Yeah, so for example here it says Baker, and so Baker is coded into something in HISCO and then gets, so it's probably more like a judge giving this high score. And in the other case it's from HISCO to HISCO and then into HISCAM. So here's the same. But you can also see there are a lot of orphaned blue dots, meaning that that same occupational title coded into HISCO, then transformed into HISCO and then into HISCAM, ends up at a very different position, which is bad because that means there's already mobility, but these were the same occupational titles. So this is exactly Calvert's point. Now if you do a correlation, so on the x-axis we have HISCAM direct, so that's HISCO to HISCAM, and on the y-axis we have the NAP version, so HISCO to HISCAM. What we would expect is this diagonal line, right? So each point should have gotten the same the same score, and so in this graph we see that actually a lot of these occupations get the same scale score, which is great. But we also see there's quite some variation. And if you look at the explained at the correlation parameter, that's 0.78. Now 0.78 is, so the maximum is 1. So 0.78 is pretty high. But these are the same data. So in terms of explained variance, we should have explained 100% of variance. And we lose quite a big deal. So now we know, because we took 1,000 of the same occupational titles. But suppose you would compare your US data with Swedish data, and you weren't aware of this issue. You would be comparing two very different things. So I think this is a problem, and we're tackling that with a team. And so what we're trying to do is so it's not the perfect solution, but it's working towards a solution. So the first thing we say, if you coded any data, please share it. Yeah. Why? Because probably you used someone else's file already. Yeah. So there are different files for different languages around already. So just help growing the number of occupational titles. And in addition to getting more occupations coded, it also helps with intercoder reliability. So that basically means does your coding work in the same way as I do? And then in the paper by Gansebo, you can actually see that it's not given that two people would code the occupations in the same way. So it might very well be that you code in a different way HISCO than I would do. The other thing is we would like to work towards machine learning algorithms. So rather than have people code all the data, we have machines code the data for us. Now what they need is samples from humans from which they can derive patterns, and using these patterns they can then code occupations they have not seen before. And the third solution, and that's actually what the team and I are working on, is use linked data for provenance. So this is linked data is a technique which you basically are aware of because it's basically internet. But rather than connecting websites, it's connecting basically everything you can describe. So also data. So if you think of websites, you can add a link to another website. But if you think of your table as a website, and you had a certain value, like municipality name, so for example Madrid, you could link that name to a database which also has Madrid, and which means the same thing. And maybe that database has population size in a given year. So if I have data on individuals, and it lists the place of birth, I could get from the other table immediately information on that place of birth being population size. So here we see a little bit how this works. So if we start out with an occupational title, we always would like to know where it comes from. Yeah, so we create a link with a source, and then the relationship between the occupational title and the source we call was derived from. So that means that if I find an occupational occupation with a certain code, I can click on the occupation and I get information on where does it come from, by whom was it coded, because then I can correspond with this person and say, oh, I did it differently. The other good thing about this, links, so in the table you're always in this table structure, it's fixed. But this is more like a graph pattern, so you can have multiple links. So you could have an occupational title that's coded by Lee Shaw Taylor, the one working on PST. So he could code that occupation in PST. Chris Evans could code it into HISCO. So Chris Dibben, he's from SLS, he could code his occupation into HISCO. Now, I might not know this and code the occupation again using something very different. Is that a problem? Well, it's a problem if we don't know it, but it's not a problem if we combine all of this information. And then using linked data, it's very easy to find different codings for the same occupation. And then depending your context or whom you trust, you can say, okay, I'm going to use Chris's code or Richard's code. And then, so this HISCO is obviously then linked to HISCAM or HISCLASS or whatever thing you would like. So this is an example of linked data, something we're trying to achieve. And the good thing, if we know about this, we can expand on it. So some people are really good at text analysis. So they're able to retrieve information on occupations from historical newspapers. So we can add that information and to have us help code. What does an occupation mean, for example? Maybe that 9999 occupation is described somewhere in a newspaper. But it also works the other way around. So if you read in a newspaper something about an occupation, you don't know what class it is or whatever. But if you feed that information back into the newspaper, you might get a very different idea about what you're reading. And so I think that's a really great thing of linked data, that you're able to link between different fields of research and helping each other out by combining this information. And of course you can do all kinds of fun stuff like add this information to Wikipedia, or the DBpedia would be the linked data variant, so to enrich public sources. So now it says demo, and this is always then the exciting. This is always the exciting part. Actually, Diego and I had a bet on Spanish occupations, and whether it would work to have Spanish occupations in this linked data system. And now I was gratefully donated the efforts by the two Spanish projects, one on the Spanish occupational titles and one on the Catalan occupational titles. So this is the data that I was sent. Now I've only done a very small part of it, but I now hope to show you this data. So what you can see is, so this data it is providing the so maybe if I make it, does it? No, I don't get it bigger. But so this column, so you can't read it, but this column provides occupational titles, and here are the HISCO codes. But for example, we don't know about the HISCAM scores. So let's see whether we can try and derive those. So last night I uploaded these into our system, and then let me. I just need to check the name of the file. Okay, so this URL is currently our system, and you can see it says resource, and then HICO Digos is the name of the project that created all of these titles. Now you can see it's a website, and so it has these occupations. So it doesn't have them all, it's just a sample. And you can see it has this link, was derived from. So if I click on this link, you get all of this information from other projects from which something was derived. Now, if I completed this information, so these are all, so you can see this Wikipedia and all kinds of other things. So if I completed this project, it will have a listing for the HICO project as well. Now, so these are occupational titles. I have no clue what they mean. This one seems fun, Adabador. And so I clicked on it, and so you can see, well, it has a preferred label, so nice spelling. Adabador. Can someone tell me what we're talking about? No? Is it? Oh, it's maybe it's not a real thing anyway. But we can see. Okay. But we can see what HISCO is linked to it, because we uploaded it into our system. So here's the HISCO, and this is of course information that was in the file. So the project decided that this HISCO goes with that occupational title. But because we have all the occupations linked to the HISCO, and in our system we have the HISCO linked to our HISCAM, we get all the HISCAM scores for free. So by uploading this dataset, we now also have information on, for example, this U1. This is the HISCAM score 6033. So this occupation of what was it? Hang on. Okay, let's take one that is a proper administrator. Rentas. Does that make sense? Is that a retired administrator or? I'm a bit scared that these are Spanish occupations, but are they? Alcalde?
Yeah.
Yeah, this I know from Zorro. Okay, so Alcalde. So it comes with the HISCO of 2110, and if we click on that HISCO, we get the HISCAM scores for free. So, for example, the universal HISCAM score for this one is 93.36. But if you said, well, actually my Alcalde is from early 19th century, you could say I am taking the early HISCAM score, and then actually it's even higher, than in the U1. So this is kind of point and click, so to demonstrate the purpose that, so you know websites, but we can have data like that as well. So I now might try to get some information in a more aggregated way. So if we would run this query. So this is kind of like SQL or SPSS or R or whatever you use. This is only called Sparkle, and it's a language that you use to query this linked data. So these website data. And so here I ask for give me, say, all of the labels, and then there's a whole blah blah blah, and then it says filter language label is Spanish. So basically I say give me all the labels where labels are in Spanish, and so this gives me all Spanish records in the table. So now it only shows 50 because I said okay, limit it to 50. So the next step would be to get the HISCO code for that. And basically that's cheating because that was information that was in the Excel file that was derived. So this 06510 is something that was in the Excel file. What isn't in the Excel file is say information on the HISCAM score. So we could say, okay, get me information on HISCAM early, HISCAM late, and then rerun it. Okay. And so it's grabbing this from the server. So you see it's also pretty quick. So we could also, going to make some people very, very mad now at the VU Computer Science department. So if we, you see, ask now for 2000 and still, results come in pretty quick. Now the great thing about this is you can download it right away. So if you download the CSV, you get all the data, and you can use it to do your own research. Is that all I wanted to show you? I think yes. Yeah. So let's go back to this one. Oh, sorry about that. This is a mess. Okay. Let's. So the only thing I wanted to say that. So we are still working on this technique, like you saw. It's kind of cut and paste here and still there. So obviously we are trying to go to a system where you can actually upload your own occupations, and there's occupational coding automated based on what we have. Right now you can do that already, but it's very limited because it will just look at exact matching. So if you have a set of occupations, it will just look at exact matching with your occupations, or you could do maybe a little bit fancy with like this distance 1. So if it's just a little bit of spelling error, we still try and match it. But this is something, that it's not good enough to show you, but it's coming. So for the moment, this is already something easy to use. So the queries, we have them on the website, so you don't need to type it. You can just copy them, and you can then download this facility. So yeah, I think a bit earlier than expected, but this is basically what I had to say.
So imagine that you have a team of people who wants to get your help on coding those occupations that you don't have, or in ISPA HISCO, the Spanish version of the HISCO, or the Catalan HISCO, and then you want to add this new coding. So what it will be the kind of process that they will need to follow. It could be just we can use your kind of online coding tool, which is a wonderful idea and a very good way as well to gather a better dictionary or
yes. So so I'm to be honest, I'm not that good with queries yet, so I can't show you on the moment. But you could say, so give me all HISCO codes that. Give me all occupations coded with HISCO codes from the book, from the HISCO book. And then you could say, now show me the ones that are not, so HISCO codes that are not originating from the book. And so then it's very easy to see which new codes are derived. So it's basically just a filter. And then you could say, okay, well, maybe we see maybe 5 new codes. Let's sit down, I don't know, in a committee or at a conference where this is the topic, and say, well, does it make sense? And then maybe for 1 or 2 say, oh, but there's this code and everyone uses that. And for another one it might be, oh, this is really a new one. We are now adding that to the HISCO code. So indeed, it allows you to compare who coded into what. And it's not to finger point. But for example, in Cluj, they're really hard at work as well in coding occupations, and so they also run into the same issues probably that you have in Spain for especially 18th and 19th century occupations. So if you downloaded the file via the email or just via the click download file as, it's probably somewhere down in your downloads folder. If you download it through GitHub, you should see this Demography Today lecture folder, and it's always, I think, good to organize inside that folder your data. So what I should have done is put these PDFs in a folder called presentations. I didn't. So in data, there's say the data which we'll use. There's actually a book by Scott Long on the workflow of data analysis using Stata. Now we're using R, but the philosophy behind this book is very good. It kind of provides a standard structure for all of your projects. So one thing that I tend to do is I create a data folder which has two subfolders, source and derived. Now, source is the data that I got from someone else. So here I always stick in CSVs that were sent to me by email or USB. And in derived, I always put the data that I created. Or for example, if I get raw data and I clean it, then the raw version is in source and the clean data in derived. So this is from Scott's long book, The Workflow of Data Analysis using Stata.
Is that the name of the book?
Yeah, the workflow, yeah, that's the name of the book. The Workflow of Data Analysis using Stata, Scott Long, I believe 2007. So then in the analysis folder, you will find the R file. So if everything goes missed, you at least have the R file. But for now, I would like you to open up a new, completely new R file. So I'm using RStudio. You don't need to, so you can just use R. I find RStudio convenient because it gives you this graphical user interface. It has it's for the video. It's kindly structured now because there's little space. RStudio has these 4 sections, but you can use them in any way you want. So this is usually where you code your data. This is the console, so this is where the computer says you did a good job or not. This is all the objects that you have in memory. And so here you can have like the help file or plots or whatever. Okay, so I'll widen this a little bit so we have more space for the data. So maybe it's best to really start with a clean sheet. Let me do that too. So file, new R script. So and then it's always good to make some comments. So this is the day, and so we're in Madrid at the Demography Today lecture. So and so the purpose is of this file is to practice linking HISCAM to HISCO. If you are very well skilled in R, this is like a 3-minute job. But I'm assuming people have not used R too much, so I'm doing this really step by step. If you just want to rush to the end, you can get the file from GitHub and do it yourself. So now the first thing we need to do is kind of tidy our workspace, because I have all this rubbish from a previous moment. So clean workspace, and we do that with a remove command. So basically this inner part gets all the elements that we have in memory, and the RM stands for remove, and it removes it. So now we have a nice clean environment. Then we need to load some packages. If you don't have these packages installed, don't worry, it's not really necessary for the actual linkage. So you can do install. Oh, and I did this. So if you in RStudio, if you type and it recognizes part of the command. It gives you an option, and then you can choose the option, tab. So click on tab, and then it finishes it. So what we would need for today is ggplot2, which is a package to create plots. Obviously, you can also use base R to do the plots. So if you run this, it installs ggplot. I already have it installed, so I'm not running it. So I'm commenting it out. And after you installed it, you load the package like this. Oh. And then so here in the console, you see what commands you used. So it says, okay, so far we removed something and we loaded the library. Now I need to sneak peek from time to time. I always work from a standard directory. So here you saw this is my project directory. So whenever I start working something, I set the project directory as the default. Yeah. So set working directory, and then so for me it's now Dropbox and then II projects teaching Madrid, but so hang on, let's. For you, this might be demography today lecture, or maybe it's downloads, depending on where you have your CSV file. And again, so this step is not necessary. So. So the first thing we need to do is get the CSV file into R. So I'm gonna sneak with this. I'll open so there's a little bit better for you to see. So step one is read in the file with your occupations. So now we have this very small file, but this would be the file which has your individuals and maybe marriages or what you have not. Then so the command is read CSV, and then so for me this is the path from onwards here. And so it could be that for you, it's more like something like this. So home directory, downloads. So yeah, so is that clear to everyone? So this is relative to whatever where you have the file stored. Okay, if you then run the command, you should see a data frame in here. And if you don't, please raise your hand. It's not a shame. There's always. So if people are on Windows computers, the slashes are in the other direction. Yeah, and it's always a bit of a hassle. So the error prone, or in order to avoid errors, you can go into Windows Explorer, copy the entire path, and then say df read CSV, etc. up until the file. So I see no fingers. Does it mean everyone has it?
Yeah, but I think I have a different one.
Yeah, you have a different file.
I have 149 observations and one variable. It's not right, probably, right?
No, that's.
No, I downloaded the file from GitHub.
Yeah. Did you maybe have the other file?
The Spanish
This
occupation.
was my problem when we were
Yeah.
first starting.
Yeah.
Is I downloaded a file
Yeah.
from GitHub, but it was more like the source link
Mhm.
file rather than the actual CSV file.
Right.
So if you actually click on it, if you open like linked file
Yeah.
like in a new window and then you save that as a CSV, that works.
Okay.
Or if you just get from the email.
I will
also.
get it from the email because the name
Yeah.
is the same.
Yeah,
So I
okay.
exactly have the
Yeah,
same.
okay,
That was
okay.
my initial problem, which is why
Okay.
there was a lot
Okay,
of confusion.
okay.
at the beginning.
If you can explain it to me, I'll later on we'll
Yeah, of
edit
course.
this in a screencast. Okay. Now the sometimes annoying thing with R is that if you read in string variables, it creates factors out of them. So actually that's good behavior, but sometimes not what we want. So in order to avoid the strings being converted to factors, we add this subcommand strings as for factors is false. And this means it preserves your strings as strings. So let's see whether, so on the right side we can see that it already worked, but let's use some commands to study it. So the first thing you could do is look at the dimensions of your data frame. Need to pull this up, otherwise I don't see. So for me it has 50 observations and 2 columns. So the names of the data frame, so the columns are apparently labeled label and HISCO. And if you just want to see a little bit more, you can use structure, str for structure. So, and there we see, so our data frame has a label variable which is of character, so these are the occupations, and it has HISCO scores, but these are integers. Now there's one thing you always need to note. You see that, for example, this HISCO code has only four digits. That means that the 0 that used to be in front got lost because it's an integer. For this purpose, it doesn't matter because the HISCAM files are stored as integers, not as strings. But so if your HISCO code is 0, 3, 0, so if your HISCO code is really 5-digit as a string, as it's supposed to be, you need to transpose it to an integer, otherwise you lose some information. So here we, so here we got lucky, so to say. Okay, then the next step is to load HISCAM scores, and so you can get those from hiscam.org. I'll show you. So this is the HISCAM website, and we should definitely update it. And down below you see the table, and you see it has all the skills that we were talking about this morning. So there's male and female for the entire time, men only, women only, early, late, and the country specific ones. And we provide them in a number of packages, so Stata, SPSS, MS Excel. And so there's no R version, but R can read in all of those. Yeah, and so we use the DAT file because that's the easiest to read in. I'm gonna copy this over to the new file to make sure everything works. So step 1 was getting in, reading in the data. Step 2 is load the HISCAM scores. So you don't need to download. Maybe actually we could have avoided the first hassle. You don't with the first file as well, but you don't need to download the HISCAM files. You can read them in from the website directly. So basically you use the read table command, and then rather than a directory you specify a URL. So this is the URL for the universal HISCAM, so men, women for the entire time. And then we provide some information on how the file is structured. So the separator is tab, so it's tab separated. And so there are headers. That means there are say column names, and then there's strings as factors. Yeah. That's again false. We don't want factors. Now, if you select that and run it, so you can either press run or command enter, and you now see up here a new data set. And if we just ask for the structure directly, we see it's a data frame with 1,300 observations, and has two variables again. One is HISCO, and the other one is the HISCAM score. Is there a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Problem here because there are not all options. So when we try to open
This, yeah.
the program doesn't work. Only.
Okay. Is this the first file or the?
No, but yes, it's the first file because when we try to open the file
Yeah.
download,
Okay.
don't work.
But they are also not in the email.
I think it's all the same problem that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
Let me. Okay. Let me.
do you want me to email the CSV file to you?
Or just put it on the slide.
Let me see whether this works.
You are talking about the Spanish occupations example file, or
Yes, but
can I?
Yeah.
there are two problems.
So yeah. So we're trying to solve a small issue.
Yes, this is okay. This is the same problem that I had to begin with. So it's because the file is not. Is this? Can I? But that was what. So what happens? What happened is. Oh wait, this is the one you download. Ah. I think here you have to even click on it.
Okay. I see.
Oh, okay. Maybe you just have to. And then see if it will pass. See if it passes. Because there's some issue, I don't understand what it does exactly. But there's some issue when you just download the file from GitHub the way that it does. So I think you just have to copy paste them. So, because this file is this one. It's the one you were trying to download. So now this is the correct text. So where we are now is. But then also, do you have, did you download the data? This one? Ah, okay,
We try to check the program.
right. Can I try this? Because I think, yeah, see, this is why, it's the same problem. Okay, so what we do then is, and now you can see this as the same thing. Is this the stuff? Okay. Okay, now try. It will work now if you read it. See that it's fine.
Are they up to par or same? Okay, so it's a lot to type, but this would read it in directly. But it's maybe for afterwards, and then we continue for now. So if I run this, it reads in this file directly. Sorry, I should have thought of that.
Do you have that? Where's the output? Do you know? I don't know. But it should be easy. Where is your output? No, it's the R. I don't understand because I use our studio.
Okay. You know what we'll do? So at the end of the lecture, we'll make sure this works for you as well. Yeah. So then we try now to go on.
Follow probably one each, and then
Yeah.
you can see one here and the other one there, and you can just follow with it.
Yeah.
Can
Okay. I'm sorry about that.
I?
Yeah, of course. Sorry, I was just.
Okay, so sorry for the confusion. So step one was read in a CSV file, and now we're at step two, which is read in HISCAM table. So we looked up the URL of the table. That's how we discovered this, and then so we add some information on the format of the file, and then we want it and to see whether it worked. We use the string command. And we indeed see, okay, so there's a data frame now, HISCO, HISCAM, scores, they're all there. And again, we see, so HISCO is an integer, so it has 4 digits rather than 5 digits. This is always a hassle. So if you try to merge an integer with a string variable, it doesn't work. So this is an important thing to note. Okay, so now we have 2 files. The occupational titles with HISCO and the HISCAM scores with HISCO. So the thing is to overlay these, and we do that with a merge command. So step 3 is merging. Just pasting it below here. So we create a new name, MDF. And so we use the merge command, and the merge command works like this: file number 1, file number 2, and then so in this case we have 2 variables which are called HISCO, and then you could just do nothing. So if you do merge df HCOM u1, it will merge it, but it's safer to always specify it. Even if it's the same name. If you, it's just if you read the code, it's so much easier to see, okay, you know, I did it right, or sometimes you want to have occupation of the groom and occupation of the father, and if you just call it occupation, it might lead to confusion. So I always specify it even if it's the same. So in the X file, which is df, we have HISCO, and in the Y file, which is HCOM U1, we have also HISCO. And then we need to say, what do we want to do with the cases that are not matched? So in this case, we want to preserve all our occupations, even if they're not coded. Yeah, that's the same thing to do. And we don't care about HISCAM scores for which we don't have occupations. So those can go. So we say all X is true. Now, we select it, run it. And then we look at the file, string mbf. And then actually we see it worked, or at least partially. We see that there's HISCO occupations, and there are these ugly things in there. That's an encoding error, but it doesn't really matter because we have the HISCAM scores anyway. That's another great thing about using classification skills. You don't need to worry about these things anymore. So that's basically what we wanted. So we had the HISCO scores, and now we have the HISCAM scores. So let's try and redo that, and maybe I leave you to it for a little bit. So you could repeat what we did in the lecture, and that is download the early HISCAM scores and download the late HISCAM scores, and then see how they relate for the same occupations. Yeah, that's kind of... shall we do that together, or do you want to try it yourself a bit, and then do it together? Maybe.
I think it's better together because
we do it together. Yeah, we do it together. Great. Okay, so let's do this again. Now merging early and late HISCAM scores. Go away. So basically what you should do is copy paste from HUCOM U1, and so I'm gonna do that as well. So this is so we're now calling it HCOM early, E for early. We read in the table file. So all you need to change is the U1 into E. That's all you need to change. And then you run it. And see whether it worked. So now we have HCOM E, and we have HISCO and HISCAM. Anyone got an idea what the next step is? So what would happen if we merge these HISCAMs with the file that we had earlier? So we already have a file with HISCAMs. So if we merge these in, we lose the difference. So we need to rename the file. So if we type names HCOM E, you get the names of that file, and we want to change the second one. So something like names HCOM E, and then so there are two. So we want the second one. Look, it says HISCAM, and we want to change that to HISCAM early. And this needs to be, because it's a string, it needs to be within brackets. So we change it, and then after you change something, you always check it. And now we see we have HISCO and HISCAM early. Yeah, so if we repeat the structure command, we can now see we have values for HISCAM early. Okay. So let's repeat that for the late one. So I'm just copying in, getting more confident. Late HISCAM. We need to change the name of the data table, data frame. I'm sorry. We need to change the URL HISCAML. All the other things stay the same. except here we also want to change the name to HISCAM late. Okay, so first run the read table and see whether it worked. String H. So did this work for you?
Yeah, but it will, yeah. I'm not
Okay,
there yet to
okay.
the late codes, but the early ones did.
Okay, great.
So it is
Yeah.
just changing the...
Yeah, so for the late, it's just copy paste, and then you need to change it in 2 places. So how you're going to call the file and the URL. And then so we need to change here the name of the file as the name of the column as well. So let's do that. So we ask for names. The names in the data frame HISCAM but we only want the second element, and we call it HISCAM late. And then we ask for the names just to check whether we did it right, and this is just to ask for the entire data frame. Okay. So now let's merge these in. So just in order to avoid mistakes, I'm copying this. So I'm creating a new file. So we had MDF, so this is MDF2, if you so you could also call it MDF early. So we merged the previous file that we had, MDF, with HISCAM early. And so the merge command you can just copy paste from up here, line 37, round and about. So just copy this, and then you paste it here. So MDF2 is going to be the merge of our previous MDF file and our HISCAM early file that we created. And again, we merge HISCO by HISCO, and we preserve all the cases in this instance. We could also do so we preserve all the occupations in this instance. Let's see whether that worked. Oh. Well, that looks. I need to fumble a little bit with my space here. So we have a data frame, indeed, 50 observations, and we now have HISCO, the occupation, HISCAM, and HISCAM early. Yeah, so that seemed to work. You also notice that at least the first 3 didn't differ. It's for a minority of occupations that you see changes between the universal one and the early one. Okay, now repeat this. Just copy paste. So repeat for late. So we gonna make a new one. MDF3 merge with MDF2. Yeah, so we take the file with the early, with the generic and the early, and so move it in, and then check whether all of this worked. Yeah.
Should change each came to each element.
Ah, that's a very good spot. Thank you very much. It's pair programming. Did you do this, or is it? Yeah. So it worked for you already. Oh wow, you're okay. So I'm slacking up on the students. That's not good. Okay, so we have early and late. So and now we could try and plot this. So that's why we loaded the ggplot. If you don't have ggplot, I think this is a bit of a gamble. My base R is not really good. So I think it should be something like mdf3 string HISCAM early with mdf3 string HISCAM late. This should work, and then so that's base R. Yeah, so we see, so if all of these scores had been the same, we would see a diagonal pattern. So we see some variance. I'm a little bit a fan of the ggplot package because base plotting, so base R plotting is more flexible. You can do anything with it, but basically every graph has its own syntax. So I like ggplot, especially when you're getting into R, because it always has the same syntax. So if we want to create a plot, we can say, okay, plot me something, and then you always start with the data set, mdf3. And then, so ggplot thinks of life as a canvas on which you paint. So you first provide the aesthetics, so what does the canvas look like, and then you start putting stuff on top. So this is defining the canvas. So X is HISCAM early. Y is HISCAM late. And I'm also already doing label is label. I'll explain why later on. Gonna indent it a little bit so it's better to see for everyone. So this is just the plot, and then we want points. So we add G on point, and I don't much like the gray background that is defaulted, so I do theme BW, which stands for black and white. So if you do it like that, you get. And so there's, I missed the bracket, I'm sorry. So ggplot, open bracket, ISX, open bracket, and then here there are two close brackets. Now, still wondering where it's, I think something is wrong, but let's, no, so it worked. So this is then the plot you get, and it's basically the same, of course. So ggplot is a bit more flexible if we now wanted to color code the points based on gender or whatever. What I discovered the other day, and that's why I added in the label, is Plotly. Plotly is an initiative for linked graphing. So not linked data, but linked graphing. And I wasn't much of a fan because you had to have in the beginning, you had to go to the website, and then there was a commercial activity and also non-commercial, but it all worked through the website. But now it's you can totally implement it into your R package, and it's not just for R; it's also for Excel. It's also for Python pandas. So it's really broadly implemented package. And the good thing about it is it gives you interactive graphics. So let's try and see whether this works. If it doesn't work, it's not relevant for the key issue at hand. So install open packages Plotly. And then so if that works, you can load the library. So you might need to give it a little bit of time to load. So I'm loading the library. And now all you need to do is say ggplotly p1. And then you run it again. And then, so basically we see what we already saw, right? But the cool thing now is, it's now an interactive graph. So we can now hover over the points. So we can now actually see the occupation or title. So for, is this an occupation or? No, I'm really, okay. So is this recognizable? So apparently Terrico has changed over time in its occupational status from 73 to 71. So that was just a small thing I wanted to show about Plotly, because so if you look at a pattern like this, you want to know what's the outlier, why is this here? So this gives you a little bit of more information on that. That's basically how the linkage works. So you can also now see why we're working on this other initiative where this linkage is done basically automatically for you. Yeah, so you can just download the file. If you have a file with multiple persons in them and therefore multiple occupations or multiple observations of an occupation, always make sure to also rename the occupation, the HISCO of that occupation. So, for example, if you have 5 jobs of a person, you would probably code them into HISCO job 1, HISCO job 2, and then it's all fine. But if you have a file of fathers with HISCO and files of sons with HISCO, you need to remember that you call the HISCO father and HISCO son whenever you start merging these. Otherwise, you mess up your HISCOs of fathers and sons. And so basically that's all there's to it.